Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into, well, a really fascinating and complex situation. Nepal, it's this nation strategically squeezed between, two global giants, India and China, our mission today, to unpack how these huge neighbors see Nepal, how they approach it, and maybe most importantly, what Nepal itself wants out of this. An incredibly tricky relationship. We want to get beyond the headlines, really dig into the interests and the strategies. So yeah, let's get started. To really understand Nepal's situation, this geopolitical tightrope it walks, we probably need to start with India's perspective, right? It seems rooted in so much more than just geography.
Absolutely. And what's really key here is that India doesn't just say Nepal is in its natural sphere of influence. They genuinely act on that belief. It's not just about power politics. It's almost a fundamental part of their foreign policy thinking. Sometimes that leads to actions Nepal sees as, well, interference. You see it in things like the special relationship, the open border, free movement of people. I mean, that's pretty unique internationally. And then, of course, the Gorkha regiments. You have a significant number of Nepalese citizens serving right in the Indian Army. That speaks volumes about the history. And all this is sort of formalized, on paper at least, by the 1950 India-Nepal Treaty of Peace and Friendship.
That historical and human connection sounds incredibly strong, but how does that natural sphere idea play into India's security thinking, especially now with China becoming more active in the region?
Well, it directly shapes their security concerns. For India, Nepal's stability isn't just important, it's essential for protecting its own northern border. They get very nervous about any outside influence, particularly Chinese, getting too close to sensitive areas like Sikkim or that critical land bridge, the Siliguri corridor. People call it India's chicken neck, right? It's this very narrow strip connecting the Northeast to the rest of India. So any instability in Nepal feels like a direct threat there. Economically, too, India is hugely important. Nepal's biggest trade partner, a major aid donor, lots of Indian investment in things like hydropower, infrastructure.
Okay, so you've got this deep history, the economic dependence, but also this feeling sometimes of India being maybe too involved. You mentioned tension. How does that actually play out? I seem to remember a specific event causing major problems a few years back.
Yes, exactly. That tension often bubbles up as accusations from Kathmandu about Indian meddling in their internal politics. And the really stark example, the one that did serious damage to India's image, was that unofficial blockade back in 2015. It caused immense hardship in Nepal, strained relations badly, and you could argue it gave China a real opening. It definitely pushed Nepal to diversify its options, look more towards Beijing. It was a real wake-up call about dependency.
That blockade really does sound like a watershed moment. So if India sees Nepal as this sort of natural part of its sphere, how does China even approach this? They must have a totally different perspective, right?
Fundamentally different, yes. China doesn't really talk about spheres of influence in the same way. They tend to see Nepal primarily as a uh, critical buffer state, a buffer between India and, crucially for China, the Tibet Autonomous Region. That perspective really drives their entire strategy. Their number one concern really is strategic,
Hmm.
making absolutely sure Nepal doesn't become a platform for Tibetan exile activities or any anti-China sentiment, given that long shared border with Tibet.
Oh, okay. So less about that deep cultural history India feels and more about, well, pragmatic security and a very specific strategic goal related to Tibet. How does that show up in what China does economically and diplomatically?
Precisely. Economically, China has been making huge investments, particularly under the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. We're talking major infrastructure, roads, airports, hydropower projects. They're really pushing these ambitious cross-border rail and highway links through the Himalayas. I mean, the engineering alone shows a massive commitment, a long-term vision. Diplomatically, you see China steadily boosting its presence, bigger embassy, more cultural programs, aid packages. And their strategy seems pretty consistent. Keep lines open, maintain good ties, no matter who's actually in government in Kathmandu. They also strongly push Nepal to adhere to the one China policy, basically. No support for Tibetan or Taiwanese independence. And generally, they just want a stable Nepal that isn't leaning too heavily towards India or the West.
It's really striking, isn't it, how two countries right next door can look at the same smaller neighbor through such a different strategic lenses. If you sort of zoom out, what's the most basic difference in how they operate that Nepal constantly has to juggle? Is it the end goal or the methods they use day to day?
Yeah, looking at them side by side is really eliminating. The differences are quite stark, almost philosophical, you could say. India's connection is, as we said, ancient. Deep cultural, social, religious ties. It's almost familial, which brings its own benefits and, well, baggage. China's relationship is much newer, growing fast, but it feels more driven by clear strategic calculations and economic opportunities. It's perhaps more transactional, but also very focused and increasingly effective. Look at the borders. India, open border, free movement, a symbol of that closeness. China, a very tightly controlled Himalayan border, completely different approach. Economically, India's traditional focus was trade, aid, and crucially, jobs for Nepalis in India. China, especially now with BRI, is all about massive infrastructure projects, direct investment, things with maybe a longer-term strategic payoff for China. And their worries are different too, aren't they? India worries about its own security, losing influence, anti-India feelings in Nepal, and China's growing footprint. China worries about stability, anything related to Tibet spilling over and making sure India doesn't have Nepal all to itself, basically. Even how they try to build influence differs. India often leans on that shared culture, history, religion, sometimes coming across as a bit paternalistic. China uses its economic muscle much more overtly and consistently champions Nepal's neutrality.
Right. So India anchored in history and this sphere idea. China focused on the strategic buffer and economic leverage. It really paints a picture of the immense pressures Nepal is under. But we've talked a lot about the giants. What about Nepal itself? Amidst all this, what does Nepal actually want? How much real choice or agency does it have in this whole dance?
And that is absolutely the crucial question, isn't it? Nepal's main goal, really its entire foreign policy balancing act, is about exactly that balance. It desperately wants to manage good relations with both India and China without becoming, a pawn or a satellite state for either one. Their objectives seem pretty clear. Number one, protect their sovereignty, their independence. Number two, get the maximum economic benefits possible from both neighbors, leverage the aid, the investment. And number three, try very hard not to get caught in the middle of any escalating rivalry between India and China.
Avoiding being a pawn. That sounds like walking a very fine line, given the power disparity and those very distinct agendas we've discussed. How realistic is that, really? Can Nepal actually leverage its position effectively, or is it always reacting to pressures from Delhi and Beijing?
Well, that's the constant challenge, isn't it? It's this perpetual delicate negotiation. Success really depends on Kathmandu's ability to skillfully play its diplomatic cards, assert its own interests, and extract what it needs from both sides without alienating either too much. It requires really sharp diplomacy and ideally a strong sense of national unity on foreign policy, which, given Nepal's own internal politics, can sometimes be, well, challenging in itself.
It truly is an extraordinary balancing act Nepal has to perform, doesn't it? Positioned, like you said, literally and figuratively between these two giants. Its geography forces this incredibly complex strategic position, but it's also a reminder that even smaller nations have agency. They have choices to make.
Exactly. And it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Considering these powerful, distinct interests from its neighbors and the sheer weight of their influence, what does the future of Nepal's sovereignty, its actual strategic autonomy, really hinge on? What internal factors or